Hello to all the listeners out there. It's noon here in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, and I'd like to welcome you to our April webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, an associate editor with Hoard Dairyman, and I have the pleasure of co-hosting this webinar with the infamous Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois. We are proud to bring you today's webinar on cow welfare and farm size, opportunities and challenges. Presenting will be Dan Weary from the University of British Columbia. Dan and his colleagues at UBC are doing some outstanding work in the areas of cow comfort and cow welfare. We are very excited to have him with us here today. This particular webinar is brought to you by Hoard Dairyman. We've been holding these webinars for 4 years now, on the second Monday of each month at noon Central Time. We'd like to extend a thank you to Jim Balls from the University of Illinois, who's our web producer. He's the one that's working behind the scenes and supports us with all the technology, making sure that you can hear us and that we can provide these webinars for you. I will now hand the microphone over to Mike Hutchins, who will introduce our speaker and get the webinar started.
Well, very good, Abby, and we're pleased to have you online again, and we are excited to have Hoard Dairyman co-sponsoring with us on this webinar here. I'm excited to introduce our guest lecturer here today, and that's Dr. Dan Weary from up in Vancouver, British Columbia, at the University of British Columbia. Dan is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies there and Professor of Applied Biology and Animal Welfare. He got his degrees work at McGill University and also at Oxford, and then did some postdoctoral work as well. Dan is no stranger in terms of the animal welfare area. He's been very active in this area, looking at such things as cow comfort, free stall design, calf housing, calf rearing, and that whole area there. So without any further ado, Dan, we welcome you to your Hoard Dairyman webinar, and we look forward to your presentation. Welcome aboard.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks, Abby. It's a real pleasure to participate in this series. I'm really looking forward to getting the questions and feedback from the audience, too. So, yeah, today I'm going to talk about this difficult topic of farm sizes. As farm sizes increase, it's often a lightning rod for criticism in agriculture. That's not just in dairies, but of course dairy sizes have been increasing too. And one of the things I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about that criticism and about what the data shows in terms of what are the potential problems with as we get to larger farms, but also I think some of the opportunities that larger farms provide in terms of really providing good living environments for dairy cows. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors here. Jesse Robbins is a PhD student in this program, is a fantastic student, and he's actually writing a research article on this issue of welfare and farm size, so stay tuned for that. And of course, my two fellow professors here at UBC in the Animal Welfare Program, David Fraser and Marina von Kaiserlink, and they're all played an important role in developing the ideas that I'm about to tell you about today. I'd also like to start off, it's sort of the other way around than most people do it, but I want to start by thanking the sponsors for our work here at UBC. Our program wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the support of our dairy industry, and first and foremost the Dairy Farmers of Canada, but also the BC Dairy Association, Alberta Milk, other organizations you can see on this slide, and we also have a program here where the federal government matches those industry dollars, especially where they see projects that are going to benefit industry, but also have some aspect of public good. So we're very proud of our association with the dairy farmers and grateful for their support. I'd also want to say it's not just money, but it's also these industries take part in our advisory board, and so they're giving us day-to-day input in terms of the kinds of projects that are important. And that's really affected the way we look at the kind of research that we do and the kinds of solutions that we come up with as well. I also wanted just to take a minute to show you a little bit about where I'm from. This is our own farm. UBC Dairy Center. It's located in Agassiz, British Columbia, which is about an hour east of Vancouver. It's in the beautiful Fraser Valley. It's one of the best places to rear dairy cows on this planet. We've got beautiful growing season, wonderful grass and corn. We have this fantastic facility. You can see in the slide in the top right-hand corner is our milking parlor, looking out with a mountain view, and beside it is a beautiful calf barn. And the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the inside of one of our barns, and you can see it's sort of a fairly conventional, open, freestall facility. Our farm looks very much like our neighbors' farms. We're right in the heart of BC's dairy industry in the Fraser Valley. And that keeps us honest. Our farm actually has to turn a profit. That's the way we pay our bills. The university doesn't give us any extra money. But I think we have one of the nicest farms in the area. I think one of the nicest farms in the world, actually. And we're also open to the public, and we really encourage people to come by and visit us. So if you ever make it up to this region of British Columbia, any of our listeners, I really encourage you to come by for a visit and have a look at our farm. One of the things that I point out here on this slide is because we are based right in the middle of our own dairy industry, and because we're funded by the industry and work closely with our partners and our neighbors, we very much focus on trying to find practical solutions which benefit the animals but also work well for the people who take care of those animals. And I'll try to illustrate some of those examples as we go along today. I also, given that today we're talking about farm size, also just want to make a point about the size of our farm. We're milking about 250 cows now, and that's sort of about a mid-sized dairy for our region. The average is maybe about 130, but there's lots of farms in or about our farm size of about 250 cows. Now this next slide isn't going to come as any surprise to people in the dairy industry, but to me it always makes an impact. On the y-axis you see the number of farms, and on the x-axis we just have time. This is redrawn from USDA data, and I just added in last night the most recent point, some of the 2012 data, which shows that we're now at 51,000 farms in the US, down from over 600,000 farms in the 70s. Now that of course has gone hand in hand with the number of cows on each of the farms. So we have a declining number of farms, increasing farm size, and that's really changing the face of what dairy farms look like, of our dairy industry. And I think it's important for us to just take a minute and think a little bit about how that kind of changing face of the industry really sort of jars against some of the public sensibilities of what a dairy farm is supposed to look like. And so here I've got this lovely sort of bucolic traditional farm, probably a tie stall. Cows are outside now in this summary picture, so the cows having some access to pasture. But you can imagine the kind of technology. Maybe some of the older listeners of the audience will have been in farms like this, and will know what it looks like both inside and out, and some of the management practices. And then you contrast that with the larger dairies of today, and obviously the differences in scale, differences in the types of technology that are required to run a large dairy like this, differences in some of the management practices too. Often these kinds of large operations really require much greater professional structures, off-farm labor, all sorts of different features that change what it means to be a dairy farm, and certainly change what a dairy farm looks like. And I think it's important to think about this also because the kinds of links that the people, the general public, have with farming and their thoughts about what a farm have these sort of deep cultural roots. And often those sort of our deepest associations with farming are very positive indeed. This wonderful quote from Thomas Jefferson: "Those who labor the earth are the chosen people of God, if you ever had a chosen people. And it reflects that true reverence for the people of the land, this agrarian ideal. But that agrarian ideal is also tied up in part with this idea of smaller farms, family farms, etc. And that ideal, of course, comes under threat or comes under criticism as the nature of farms change. And so we see these kinds of critiques that are illustrated beautifully on the side of this old barn about some of the perceived issues associated with moving towards larger farms. And of course, there's all sorts of criticisms that are leveled at larger farms. But today I'm just going to really talk about the issues around animal care. And in general, the kinds of issues that are at play here is this idea that we're going from sort of a family-owned and operated operation to something which is corporate controlled. The idea that we're switching somehow from an ethic of individual animal care to one where decisions are made just about sort of economics or greed. And that also we're switching from this idea of having this sort of time-tested animal husbandry methods that work well with the nature of the animals, and we're switching to these new technologies that may have negative impacts on the animals and even the people who work with the animals. So that's the sort of the nature of this criticism, and we see this criticism these types of criticisms being made more and more loudly in the sort of public sphere nowadays. This is just an illustration of some recent books out there on these kinds of issues. Many of you, of course, will have come across The Omnivore's Dilemma, extremely popular book. Also, the very popular movie Food Inc. I just with some friends over the weekend, and somebody was grilling me there on issues about Food Inc. and issues about care of animals and the changing face of farms. These are probably all issues that others in the audience have to deal with when they sit down and talk to their neighbors and friends. The question really is, though, that's the critique. That's the idea that these switch towards larger farms somehow is jeopardizing the care and the lives of the animals that we have the responsibility to care for. But is it actually true? And so I thought I'd start off today with a little bit of a question to get you guys thinking, to hear what your own opinions are. And I don't know if you'd like to just to take over the poll question here, Mike, but the basic question I want people to answer is where do you think cows have better lives? Do you think it's true that cows have better lives on the smaller farms? Do cows maybe have better lives on larger farms? Or do you think maybe that farm size doesn't really affect animal welfare all that much? So over to you.
Okay, very good, Dan. Well, we're off and running. Abby, have you voted yet? I've got my vote figured out at this point. We'll move on. We're zipping right along here. We must, Dan, we're almost at 70% already, and we're only 40 seconds in. So, Jim, let's go ahead and close the polls, and we're at 73%. Looks like we're stabilized, and we will show the results. And Dan, I assume you can see the results. Is that correct?
I can see the results. So we got a lot of people that are sitting on the fence. So I'll look for more, see if you guys have stronger opinions as we go along a little bit further in the presentation. But basically what I want to do now in the next part of the presentation, just go through some of the data that we have on this issue. And I have to sort of come clean with you guys, is that this is an issue we didn't set out to study farm size. We've set out to, as Mike mentioned in the kind introduction he gave me, that we've been doing work around cow comfort and barn design issues for years, and we've been very interested in terms of how different farms sort of succeed and fail in terms of the kinds of barn design issues that they provide for their animals. One of the approaches that we've been doing is going more and more out onto commercial farms to look at diversity in the way individual people build farms and manage those farms. This is a picture of one of our former students, Kiyomi Ito, who has been a fantastic leader in some of this on-farm work. We've been partnering with a company called Novus and have been to farms all over Canada and all over the United States, and actually most recently now in China, as just telling Jim about, and looking at cow comfort issues primarily. Farmers have been really interested in getting feedback in terms of how their own cows are doing. One of the things we've been doing for those farmers is we've been putting these little data loggers on the cows, which tell us how much time the cows have been lying down, and that gives the farmers a feel for how their facilities are doing. One of the things we've been really proud of about that project is that each farmer gets an individualized report, and that lets them know basically how they're doing in relation to their neighbors. So this is a benchmarking approach where the farmer can see, in this slide, for example, here's one sort of hypothetical report, and you can see that on average the cows on that farm are lying down about 9.5 hours a day, and you can see that that farm, where it fits relative to sort of the other farms in that producer's region. Couple of useful things here. One of the things, we've done 20 years of research in our own research facility, and working with a dedicated your own research farm has huge advantages, but you go out onto commercial farms and every individual has got different sorts of constraints. And so for me, it really keeps the research honest to go out there and see how the problems that real life farmers are having, and also the variety of solutions that they can use in order to solve those problems. I think one of the things that the farmers really like about these reports is that they're looking at their results in relation to other individuals within their same region. And that means that everybody's playing by the same rules. Sometimes when I show the results from our own research farm, the farmers will say, well, yeah, you do that because you have a research farm. But in this case, the farmers are looking at their results relative to other individuals in their same region, all that are sharing the same kinds of constraints. They're all similar kind of genetics, similar kind of feed, all getting the same price for their milk, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's it really keeps it real and makes these kinds of benchmarking exercises very useful for the farmers. Now, we've been looking at all sorts of outcomes on their farms. One of the things that we've been really promoting in this study is getting people more aware of lameness, because we think lameness is obviously an important production problem, really affects the farm economics, but it's also a huge welfare problem because when cows go lame, well, it's painful and it can last a long time. So we've been very interested in getting people to do a better job of actually recognizing their lame cows in an early stage. And so as part of that effort, we've been benchmarking lameness on these farms. I'll show you what that data looks like. I'm going to start off by showing you data from some of our own farms here in British Columbia. So we just have farms along the x-axis, and these are just ordered from best to worst. And then we have the percentage of cows that are scored as clinically lame. Clinically lame means that the cow is not varying weight equally on all legs. And you can see this with a bit of training. It's not the cow that's three-legged lame, that's sort of hopping along, that anybody can see. These cows, you can pick them up as soon as you have a little bit of training, and someone with a good cow eye picks these cows up pretty easily. And you can see in these BC farms, on average, about 30% of those cows are scoring clinically lame. You can see a couple important points from these kinds of graphs. One is that there's some farms that are doing extremely well. In there, about 5% or under 10% lameness. And then you can also see, of course, there's some tail enders. One of the things that's really interesting in terms of working with this kind of data and showing this data back to individual farms, the data is all confidential, so nobody knows whose points are whose, except each farmer knows their own point. And had some great conversations with the individual farmers looking at this data. For example, speaking to actually some of the farms, some of the very best farms, it's been interesting to see this attitude of, well, gee, I see here I'm at 8% lameness. I want to know how I can get that even better. And often, really regardless of where people are on the graph, I think it serves as a bit of a wake-up call. that these are often cows that they themselves haven't been seeing, and it starts a conversation with them thinking about what are the features on their farm that they might be able to change to bring those numbers down. And I think another sobering thing on these graphs is seeing these tail enders, and that it doesn't necessarily represent a lot of farms, but I think it's these kind of farms that actually are a real issue and can get the rest of the industry into trouble too. One of the fun things about this project is we've been working on these different regions, as I told you about. This is our own British Columbia region, and as I said to you earlier, our farm's here averaging about 130 cows. In this sample, this graph you see here, all the farms are over 100 cows, but we're about average of about 150, 160 cows in the graph I'm showing you here. In this next set of data here, these are farms in California. So again, these are all freestall farms. In this case, the average farm size for the data I'm showing you is 2,500 farms. So big differences in farm size. But the actual shape of the graph looks pretty similar, doesn't it? So again, you can see the good news is there's a lot of farms doing very well off on the left-hand side of the graph. And then, of course, there's some farms that are having more trouble off on the right-hand side of the graph, a few tail enders again. Another region we've done some work is in Northeast United States, primarily in around New York. And this is sort of an odd graph. It's almost like those California and BC data have been rotated 180 degrees. So we still have some farms in this region doing very well in terms of lameness, low lameness rates. But there's fewer of those farms. And then we've got quite a number of farms where the lameness rates are actually quite high. Now, in that case, those farms in the Northeast are a little bit bigger than the ones we have in BC, but they're a little bit smaller than the ones in California. One of the things, the other sort of advantages of this kind of data is, as I said, to me the best part is actually giving that data back to the individual farms, allowing them to look at how they're doing and to come up with their own ideas for how to improve things on their farms. We've been actually now going back and revisiting a bunch of farms that have had a chance to look at their data and then done some changes, and we've seen some remarkable improvements on those farms. And I'll tell you more about that data, perhaps if I get invited back here another time. But some really exciting stuff coming out of that data. But the other thing that we can do as scientists is we can look across all of this data we have, all these hundreds of farms, and see if there's certain types of farm practices that are really associated with high levels of success when it comes to cow comfort, or in this case, lameness that I'm telling you guys about now. And so what are some of those features about the way people design and manage their facilities that are related to lameness? And what I'm going to tell you is that there's one feature that above all is predictive about rates of lameness on farms, and that is simply the line surface that's provided to the cows. Farms that use deep bedding have much lower rates of lameness. So here we see the sort of statistics on that. What I'm presenting here is what's called an odds ratio of 0.48, and that means that if you're using deep bedding, you have about 50% lower rates of lameness than if you're using some non-deep bedded surface like a mattress or a mat. So a very simple feature, and it has a huge effect in terms of lameness. So a 50% decline. I don't have time to show you the data today, but I also want to make the point that the results are even greater when we talk about something like a hawk lesion. I think hawk lesions are the simplest possible problem that we can solve on most farms because everybody can see the lesions, and there is one factor that this data is showing that can make hawk lesions disappear, and that's using deep bedding. We can reduce the rates of hawk lesions by 95% if you're providing a deep bedded surface. So quite amazing effects of terms of what the surface the cows lie on. And I think, to me, it gives quite a bit of hope in terms of providing some real-world suggestions that farmers can use to address this really important problem of lameness, and as I said, also hawk lesions, and which I think, comes right down to it, are the most important issues in cow comfort today. Okay, so I've given you one barn design and management feature that really makes a difference about lameness, but what about farm size? How does farm size relate to these lameness rates? So let's go back and look at some of the data where we're plotting out now on the x-axis farm size, and this is the farms in the Northeast here, primarily New York, but also Pennsylvania and Vermont. You can see the average farm size there is about 600 cows, but it goes up to a high of a little over 2,500 cows, and then on the y-axis is a percentage of lame cows. And you can see that certainly things are no better on the smaller farms, and if anything, things look a little bit better on the larger farms. In fact, I want you to look more closely at the data, and what you really see is that we don't have any farms where there's very high rates of lameness in the larger farms. Those very high rates of lameness, which for that northeastern region would be up above about 60% lameness. We see that those cases are all happening in those, for this region, relatively small farms, farms under 1,000 cows. Okay, now let's switch to a very different region. Let's go over to California. Different herd sizes, obviously. So here we see an average herd size of more like 2,000 cows. Again, we've got herd size on the x-axis, and we've got lameness on the y-axis. And again, sure doesn't look like things are any better on the small farms. In fact, we see the same pattern again, where we see some small farms doing well, some large farms doing well, but what we don't see is the large farms with very high rates of lameness. And in that California region, we're really talking about rates of lameness of about 50%, and you can see again, those farms are all clustered down at the lower level. Mike and I were talking before we started about China and some of the amazing things that are happening in the Chinese dairy industry. We've had the privilege of doing some work on some of those Chinese farms recently, and here's some brand new data. This is just still in press in Journal of Dairy Science, but it shows the results of that Chinese work, and you can see here again a very large range in farm size, some very large farms. But the take-home message here again is that there's some small farms which are doing well, some larger farms that are doing well, but there's none of the larger farms where we see these very high rates of lameness. And in this case would be rates of lameness, let's say, above about 35%. Those are all happening in the smaller farms, let's say farms less than about 1,500 cows. So a number of different regions. All these farms we're looking at are freestall operations, all TMR feeding, so there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences too between the regions. And despite those differences in the types of farms, types of management, we see at least this idea that things are no better on smaller farms. And in fact, the smaller farms seem to be at greater risk of high rates of lameness. Okay, so I think we've dealt with that, with at least the data we have so far in terms of the cow comfort issues and lameness, showing that there's no strong evidence that things are better on smaller farms. In fact, to my eye, things look a little bit better on the larger farms. So I want to go back now and look at some of the other criticisms that are sometimes levied on larger farms, and I want to see what you guys think about these, and then we'll walk through and look at some data related to them. So one of the issues that comes up sometimes is that larger farms are more likely to have technologies, adopt certain types of technologies, and technologies can be bad for animals or can be bad for the workers. And so is it true that we're more likely to adopt harmful technologies on larger farms? Would be one option. Second option for you to think about is that practices that benefit animal care may become less common on larger farms. So if you think about being able to really understand the individual needs of an animal, well, on smaller farm, we're more likely to know those animals, and maybe we're more likely to fine-tune our practices that benefit those individual cares on smaller farms. Another criticism that comes up is that our opportunity to provide animals access to some important environmental features may be difficult when farms become very large. And I think the biggest issue that you hear critics raise on that one is this access to pasture. And that access to pasture might just be something that's just very difficult to do on these very large farms, and that could be a problem. And I'm giving you a couple other options here. Maybe you think that all the above are problems, or maybe some of you think that none of the above are problems. So open it up to you.
Well, very good, Dan. The polls are open, and we're getting up to 60% of the vote. So I think we're going to close the polls here in about another 10 seconds. Abby, do you have I got mine picked out here.
I do as well. And yep, we have a very alert group out there voting away.
Which one are you picking? Can we put you right on the spot?
I thought this was anonymous.
Good answer, Patty.
Wow, I can see another Republican on the line as far as that goes with it. Okay, well, let's close the poll, and Dan, you can read what do you think of these answers?
Well, I mean, that's always interesting to see what people think there. There's obviously a lot of people that don't see any of these as an issue. Some that think all of them are an issue. And of the three options, if for the people that wanted to pick one, the one that was clearly the most popular is this idea that access to pasture is a difficult thing to do in larger farms. So let's like we did before, let's try to walk through what some of the evidence is around these different criticisms and see where we stack up, and see also, I think one of the things I'm going to try to do in this section is look at the evidence, but also think about how we might be able to, what are some of the opportunities here that we might be able to apply, not only on larger farms, but I think on all types of farms. And I'm going to start off, I'll switch out of the poll there, just give me a sec. I'm going to switch by starting to talk about technology. And I think it's important for us to realize that some of the most pervasive technologies we see on dairy farms are what we call, are not scale neutral. I think one of the stories that I found really impressive in terms of thinking about and reading about this area was just the importance of something like actually refrigerated milk storage. And that was something that actually changed the face of the dairy industry and our own dairy industries as they developed, because very small farms couldn't afford that. And that meant that larger farms all of a sudden were the ones that stayed in business. That obviously more important in terms of milk quality issues than cow welfare issues. But another issue, which I think, another type of technology which is very much not scale neutral, is the one that you see in this slide, and that's the milking parlor. You build one parlor, and that can service a flexible number of cows. So I think I want you to think a little bit about different types of technologies. So one which we talked a little bit earlier when I talked about bedding surface for cows. If you go and you buy a mattress, you need to buy a mattress for every stall. So that's not that. It is something which just varies with the number of animals. 1,000 cow dairy has to spend 10 times more than 100 cow dairy on mattresses. But when it comes to something like a milking parlor that can be shared among more and more animals, then you can get some real advantages to the larger dairies in terms of being able to share those costs. And we see large dairies benefiting from that more and more as new technologies come available. Some of the most recent technologies which I see as potentially providing big advantages is this real-time recording of aspects of milk quality that provide indicators of udder health and animal health, and I think that has real opportunities to change the face of the way we care for individual animals on dairy farms, and it's an advantage which is easier to access for farms that have the capital to invest in it, so larger farms. I think it's also important sometimes that when we look at large operations, and so here, just taking a picture of our own farm, just to be fair to the rest of the industry. So this is our farm, and I think the first thing you look at when you see here is you see a bunch of hardware, right? You see all these stall dividers, and then you look carefully, see, oh yeah, there's some cows down on the corner. So the cows sometimes get lost in relation to the technology, and I think that sparks the worry that, well, maybe that means we somehow lose our connection with the animals or ability to care for the animals as individuals. But the other thing you have to realize when you look at this kind of picture is, well, look at all that light coming in, all that nice fresh air coming in these big open freestall barns. The cow's able to walk around, of course. Now contrast this with a situation which would be familiar to the older participants here, and that's our old tie stall barns, where you know, the cows are tied into their stall. Sure, you get a much closer look at it, but it's a darker barn. Don't have the same air quality. Cows, in this case, on a mattress. We've already talked about the problems with some of those. Cows not actually fitting properly in the stall in this case. And so, and of course, the most obvious criticism for the tie stalls is that the cows aren't able to move around. So we see some of the real benefits of technologies like parlors in terms of being able to move towards freestall systems. Now, I don't want to give the readers, the listeners, the feeling that all our problems are solved when we move to a freestall. There's lots of problems we still need to work on in freestall, and I showed you the data on lameness, but I think there are lots of good things we can do with those facilities, and we can be proud that the cows are able to move around properly. You don't have to look back that far to see how our own industries moved in terms of the use of parlor-based operations versus tie stall-based operations. Just in 1996, this NAMS data is showing us that we had much closer to a 50-50 split in terms of the percentage of cows that were in tie stalls. And that number comes down every year as we move towards these larger farms that really take advantage of these the economies of scale associated with going to large milking parlor systems. But in addition, I think we can be using technology in a more and more clever way. So I want to just quickly go through some of our own research showing some of the clever ways in which we use technologies. These are these electronic feed bins, which just tell us when cows have been feeding and how often they come to feed, how much time they spend feeding. And we've been very interested in using that to get us measures of when cows start not doing so well, especially in terms of animal health. And this slide gives an example of the way we use that kind of data. This is Julie Hussey's data, one of our star postdoc researchers working in our group. And here you see on the x-axis, this is day relative to calving, so we're looking at the transition period. And there we're just looking on the y-axis cow intake. So the cow's eating lots of feed coming up to the day of calving. We see a bit of drop-off around calving. This is very typical. And then the cows start eating again normally. And those are the healthy animals. Julie's been really interested in the metritis as a disease, one particular type of disease, which is we think is underdiagnosed and is a sort of one of those kind of iceberg problems on dairy farms. And so here is the same data, but for cows which are mildly metritic. And also, here you see cows now that are severely metritic, and you can see big differences in those lines. And one thing I want you to notice straight away is look at the red arrow going up, which shows when these cows are typically clinically diagnosed with metritis. And look how much sooner we can pick up those cows using this kind of sensitive automatic measures. I think it shows the promise of really doing a much better job in using data and using technology on farms to, in this case, early recognition for disease and ideally preventing disease altogether. One of the things that we've been interested in this work is we see, let's go back to that previous slide, you see these cows are eating much less feed. And one reason might be just that the cows don't have an appetite if they're not feeling well. But if you go back, you see those cows are actually eating less feed even before calving. And that means even before they have any kind of really disease state, we think, and before they should have any kind of real feelings of ill health. And so we've been interested, well, what is it that makes those cows sort of less likely to visit the feeder? And one of the theories that we have is these are cows which are not able to compete with other cows in our competitive freestall environments that we provide them with. So I want you to just look at this little video we have here. And these are just cows at the feed bunk. And here's one cow here eating happily, the reactor cow, and boom, she gets knocked out of the way by the actor cow. So, of course, there's cows on our farms that are winners and losers in these kind of competitive environments. that we provide for them. And I just got one other slide to show you sort of the clever ways in which we can use the technology to pick up those cows. So this data is not just, this technology is not just telling us how much the cows eat, it's recording the exact time when the cows go in and out of these feed bunks. And if we look at that data, this is just the sort of the printout that's coming from the computer, and you can see the time, each time a cow comes in and goes out of that feed bunk, the feeding place, and then when the new cow comes in. And the difference from the time comes out and the new cow comes in is an interval. And you can see that those times when there's these kinds of competitive replacements are associated with these very short intervals between cows. And in some brand new work that Julie Hussey has just published, she's shown that we can use those very short intervals now to try to identify those loser cows, those cows that are being subjected to lots of these negative interactions. I'll just show you one of our other favorite technologies and how this can really, use of technologies really can have a big effects on animal care. These are these computerized calf feeders that are becoming more popular. One of the issues with these feeders is that often, because it's one piece of hardware, it can be shared between multiple calves, and people want to, distribute that cost among as many calves as possible. And so we often have quite a number of calves in those groups. And here's some work by Andrea Vieira, another one of our star students. And what she found is this counterintuitive finding that we see that actually, if you look at the amount of time that the calves spend in these feeders, they actually spend more time in the feeder when we feed them these low amounts of milk, sort of more typical conventional amounts of milk, about 1 gallon a day, versus when we feed the cows more milk. So if we feed the cows more milk, they actually spend less time in the calf feeder. And Andrea actually went and did the detailed work to understand what's going on there. And what she found is, look at over here, those calves getting the 4 liters a day. They go and visit that feeder a couple times, doing what we call these rewarded visits. And that means they go into the milk feeder and actually drink milk. But then they go a bunch more times in the day, and they go to try to access the feeder, but the feeder won't provide them the milk because they have their daily ration. Now contrast that with those calves that are fed as much milk as they want, and you see those calves go and visit the feeder more often to eat, maybe about 8 times a day or 6 times a day, but they hardly ever go to visit the feeder just to go check it out. And what Andrea has argued is that those unrewarded visits are really the calf just doesn't know when the feeder is going to provide milk, and it's gambling. It's going and checking it out, seeing if it'll give me milk. And these hungry calves that are getting less milk are going to do that more and more often. So I think when we think about these automated feeders, we really want to think about them perhaps more like a slot machine, where the calf doesn't know whether it's going to win or lose. And in our most recent work, we've been actually taking advantage of this. And what we found is that calves that are actually sick, or calves, for example, in that period after dehorning when they're experiencing pain, are less likely to feel lucky. They do less of those unrewarded visits. And I think that shows, again, the kind of really creative ways we can use on-farm technology to get a better sense of what's going, when things are going well and when things are going poorly for our animals. Okay, so I told you a little bit about how we can use technologies and some of the promising things that I think technologies can give us. What about standards of care? Well, obviously, if we're looking at cow that we know well, so here's a cow on one of our own farm. This is just the pasture right behind the barn I showed you earlier, and you can get a sense of the cow and who she is, but you put that cow in a much larger group, and it's much harder to see, arguably, what that animal's true needs are. And this idea that there's a limit beyond which we can't provide proper care for animals as farms get large is a common one, and we see it coming up in quotations like this famous quote from Wendell Berry. But is it actually true that the standard of care is lower on larger farms? Well, there's a bunch of different ways we can look at it. Here's a picture of Kilme again on one of the farms that I told you about earlier. And one way we can look at the relationship between cows and the people who care for them is this sort of, is the cow willing to approach the handler? You can see this one cow, 4621, isn't very shy about approaching Kilme anyways. Here's some data which addresses that. This is actually a study on Swiss and German farms. And you can see here, in this case, the farms are really quite small, representative of that region. And in this case, these authors are looking at how close the cows are willing to approach the handler. And you can see there's no real relationship between farm size. In fact, the authors of that study conclude that the quality of livestock handling seems to be totally unaffected by herd size. We can also look at how some practices that we know are good for animal care vary in relation to farm size. And this slide illustrates some really interesting and important NOMS data. And I just want to focus here on a couple measures that I think are pretty important, and those have to do with colostrum feeding. In particular, the amount of time it takes before that first colostrum is fed is substantially shorter on the larger farms. That those farmers are actually testing for the quality of colostrum much more on larger farms, and they're also testing the calves, the percentage of farms that monitor serum protein. We also see that that increases greatly when we go to those larger farms. So we see a number of practices that I think we can fairly say are associated with good quality care, and we actually see those are more common on larger farms. And this idea then that those kinds of more professionalized practices actually might be more common on larger than smaller farms is actually even recognized by some of the critics of animal agriculture. Here's a quote from the Pew Commission report in 2008 saying that, acknowledging the fact that large operations have certain advantages. For example, they can designate specific employees with specialized training, and that can be important for the animal welfare. I think this illustrates a larger issue around professionalism. And I think larger farms have to be professional in order to succeed. They have professionalized staff. They have to institute training programs that are more likely to use formal SOPs and make sure that those SOPs are actually followed. And they're more likely to use things like performance incentives. Now, that doesn't mean that small farms can't do an excellent job. They can, but I think there's a lot that all farms can learn, small farms and large farms, from these kinds of professional activities, including, for example, this idea of sharing standard operating procedures among farms. I think is a huge opportunity for the future, and in general, this move towards more professional management of our farms. Okay, I just wanted to end off with this idea that beneficial practices may become impractical on larger farms. And the way I want you to think about this is this idea of, well, if you were given the choice between living on a larger farm versus a smaller farm, well, what would you pick? And one of the things we can do as researchers in this area is give cows choices too, not this kind of a choice, but we have been giving the cows a choice between staying in our beautiful freestall barn, which I showed you earlier, or accessing that nice pasture that's just outside the door that I showed you earlier as well. And what we find when we give the cows the choice is that they do indeed often use pasture, but they often spend a lot of time indoors as well. So when you ask the question of what do cows prefer, out on pasture or inside the freestall barn, the answer is really both. And as you can see in this slide, it depends on the time of day. So here we have time of day on the x-axis, and we have the percentage of cows on the y-axis. And you can see that at nighttime, so out at midnight and the early hours of the morning, the vast majority of cows are out on pasture. During the daytime, cows in this trial tended to stay inside, and that's important because we know the cows eat the majority of their TMR during the day. And indeed, when we look at the effect of providing access to cows, pasture access to cows on TMR intake, we find this really interesting finding. So here are cows inside our freestyle barn relative to the week around calving. So this again is that transition period. This is just the amount of the mixed ration the cows are eating over that period, and these are all cows that are confined indoors. Now, next slide, oops, sorry. Next slide I've got here is cows which have access to a pasture, and you can see that even though the cows are spending their nights, in this case, out on pasture, it's not affecting their intake of solid feed at all. And that means that the milk production of these cows is identical. And I think the take-home point here is, even though accessing pasture might be a hard thing to do for larger farms, if we think about needing to provide a large portion of the cow's energy intake from grass, becomes larger as we go to more difficult to go to larger farms. What these results are showing us is that these cows are really using pasture not so much as a way of getting their energy intakes, but they're using it for other reasons. They want to be outside, I think because grass is maybe a comfortable place for the cows to spend outside, and there's other reasons perhaps for the animals that wanted to go outside. Okay, so we've gone through a number of different features here, which I think around the critique about problems with larger farms, problems around technology, standard of care, and this idea that beneficial practices like pasture access are impractical. And in each case, I've tried to provide what I think is the evidence on that issue, but also what I think are some of the things we might be able to learn and lessons we might be able to apply on all sorts of farms. One final message I wanted to leave you with is that we do know, even if farm size doesn't tell us very much about welfare risks, we do know something that does tell us about welfare risks, and that is farms that aren't making a profit. Here's a quote from some Danish researchers actually looking at cases of animal neglect. And what they found is that animal neglect wasn't really relating to farm size. What it was relating to was when farmers were entering economic difficulties. Coming back to the Lameness data I told you about earlier, another study showed that if you asked farmers whether they felt they would no longer be in business in 5 years, those farmers that thought they were not going to be in business had twice as high the rates of lameness as farmers that felt they were still going to be in business. So I think these kinds of economic constraints can be hugely important in terms of the welfare risks that are faced on farms. And this just comes back to some of that earlier USDA data I was showing you earlier, looking at whether farms are profitable. And you can see that although there are profitable farms of all sizes, the chance of a farm not being profitable becomes much greater as we get to those smaller farms. So I think as an industry, we need to do a better job of recognizing those farms that are at a risk of going out of business and being proactive in terms of trying to help those farmers and the cows on those farms. Last image to leave you with, illustrating this sort of idea around careful the agrarian ethic with these peasants on this French farm carrying the calf indoors, the cow obviously really interested in the calf and licking it, and the milkmaid interested in the cow, and this idea that these small farms are then associated with this high standard of care. But if you look closely, you also see that the farm probably isn't doing too well. At least that cow isn't doing too well if you look at her body condition score. So I think we need to be doing a better job in terms of recognizing those farms where cows are at risk of poor welfare. So some final take-home messages for you. Technology is an increasingly important tool in the dairy industry that I think can have huge benefits. That technology is probably easier to access, often easier to access for larger farms, but I think there's much more we can learn from how to use that technology, and I gave you a few examples. Larger farms are more likely to use professional management that reduces welfare risks, and farms can benefit from, I think, sharing some of these professional practices. I think having specialized staff can be hugely beneficial, but also just writing things down, these standard operating procedures, and sharing those is huge. Beneficial practices like access to pasture can be difficult to use on larger farms, so we really need research like that I showed you, which is, well, how important is it for cows to access the outdoors? It looks like it's quite important. But what are cows doing when they go outside? And could we be developing new ways of providing outdoor access to cows that actually do work for farms of larger sizes? And that might mean that the cows aren't necessarily eating lots of grass, but it might still mean for a good life for those cows on large farms. And finally, I want to leave you with that idea that cow welfare can be at risk on farms that are going out of business, and that I think we've got a shared responsibility to find proactive solutions to help those farms and cows on those farms. So thanks again to the funders, and over to you, Mike, for questions.
Very good, Dan. Abby, we'll let you kind of wrap up this, and then we'll come back. We do have questions here that we can address here in a few minutes. Abby, any final thoughts?
Thanks, Mike. And first of all, thank you to Dan for a great presentation. I think it's a topic that's definitely a conversation buzzing around the dairy industry, and gave us all something to think about and some good data to back up your thoughts. So thanks to you for that. If anyone out there in the audience would like to listen to the webinar again or share it with someone else, it will be available online later this week. This webinar and all of our past webinars can be found on our website. Just go to www.hoards.com/webinars. And there you can visit any of the past webinars that have been available. To date, over 35,000 views of these webinars have been watched. So a great resource for all of you out there. Also, for those of you that are online today, you'll be receiving a 7-question email survey later this week. In that survey, you'll have the opportunity to evaluate today's presenter and the topic. And we always appreciate any feedback that you can give us on these webinars. We hope that you'll make plans to attend our next webinar, which will take place on May 12th. It will feature an update on dairy cattle mineral nutrition needs presented by Bill Weiss from The Ohio State University. That webinar will be co-hosted by the University of Illinois and Hoard Dairyman and sponsored by Zimpro Performance Minerals. Again, so we thank you all for being online. As Mike mentioned, we do have some questions, so if you're able to stay on, we will invite Mike to present those questions and then look to Dan for his insight in answering them.
Very good, Abby. We'll do those as time permits. A couple of these are linked together. We have a colleague from Wisconsin, Dan, that says, how does one participate as a dairy instructor to enroll clients in your studies similar to the lameness scoring you had? He's up in northeast Wisconsin. Do you expand or do you welcome people to be part of your study?
So thanks very much for the interest in that. You know, we got way more. It's a program that's been hugely successful in terms of the way our partnership with Novus. If I can suggest that you speak to your Novus rep or your nutritionist for your farm to see whether that's offered in your area. But I think more generally, this is a program that we were doing, which I think shows a more general lesson, which is that providing farmers some information, some pretty basic information that lots of people could collect around cow comfort, around lameness, around hock injuries, has been hugely popular among the farmers, and giving them that data back, I think, allows them to make better decisions. And so, although I encourage you to see if the farms you work with are eligible to participate in the Novus program, there are other ways of providing this kind of service. And ultimately, it would be my dream that there would be so many farmers that want this, that there would be other mechanisms out there to provide that for them.
Dan, I assume the cow acronym, COWS, that's a Novus-sponsored program. Same answer in terms of people who would like to be part of that to go through Novus? Exactly.
But I think more generally, speak to your university extension reps, speak to the other professionals you deal with, your own nutritionists, because I think that this idea of actually collecting data on farm and giving that data back to farmers together with this benchmark, I mean, nobody owns that idea, and it's something which is of general use, I think, certainly around these kinds of things which are hard for maybe not all farmers are doing now, things like lameness scoring or things like monitoring line times, which I think can be a real advantage for farmers to make better decisions.
Dan, the question on lameness, when you were mentioning lameness, is that the lameness score 3 on the 1 to 5 system? When you say lameness, the cows that were lame in these herds?
Yeah, that's right, Mike. All the slides I showed you are for clinical lameness, which the way we score that's 3 and above. It varies depending when you use a 5-point or a 4-point scale. But I can say the results I showed you are essentially are essentially identical if you look at the severe lameness, so those cows that are hobbling. So the kinds of factors, like, for example, providing access to deep bedding is hugely protective for both types of outcomes. I can also say that the issues around farm size, it doesn't matter whether you look at clinical lameness or the more severe lameness. The results are stronger for clinical lameness because we get more cases like that.
Dan, can you click ahead one more slide as I give you your next question? If you can click one more slide on the machine. Thank you much. When you mentioned deep bedding, can you give us an idea what's deep bedding? Is that inches, centimeter? Does it vary between sand and does it straw versus say the solids, the manure solids?
Yeah, sure. Great question. Thanks very much. Basically, it's from the cow's perspective. So if the cow doesn't know what's underneath the bedding, then it's deep. That's the easy answer to that. What it is depends, of course, on the region. So in California, almost all the farms we visited were using, dried manure, recycled manure solids, because that's what they have, cheap, plentiful, and they're all deep bedded. In other regions, sand is very common for deep bedding. So, for example, most of the farms using deep bedding in our region, in British Columbia and in the Northeast I showed you, were using sand. But from the results perspective, it really looks like it's having lots of bedding is the single most important thing. It's the other way of putting it is if you can see the surface the cows are lying on, then there are likely to be problems with hock lesions and also with lameness.
Okay. When you looked at lameness and herd size, did you look at the average age of the milking cows? Was it related? I think our person is referring to maybe the larger herds have lots of heifers, for example.
Excellent question. In fact, in our data set, what we've done is all the data I showed you are for the high group, basically. So we're picking the high production group, and where possible, we're picking groups which are all multiparous. And we have looked to see whether the primiparous are problems in any of the relationships, and they're not. So for the most part, that's all multiparous data that you're looking at. The other aspect about age is the age of the facility, and surprisingly, it also doesn't. The age of the barn isn't a very strong predictor. It is in some regions, and I think it depends on how quickly that region is changing. So in those regions where there's been a lot of new facilities put in, then age can matter.
Okay, quickly, what does SOP stand for, and what is it?
Oh, that's bad if I didn't make that clear. It's a standard operating procedure. And so basically what this is all about is just writing it down. What is it that you do? Writing it down step by step so that the next person, the new employee you train, is actually doing exactly the same thing that you are. And that can be very important in terms of treating disease, in terms of colostrum-free feeding, in terms of I saw a wonderful SOP just the other day in terms of dealing with downer cows, huge problem. It makes sure, it's part of this whole concept around developing professional procedures, which means that we don't just say we're doing the right thing, we actually can document exactly what it is we're doing on our farms. We can show that the people on our farms are trained to do it. And in the best cases, that we're actually measuring the outcomes at the end and then providing incentives for people to make sure that they're doing what's supposed to be done in those standard operating procedures. I'd also say, Mike, one thing I really hope to see is just been thinking about as I develop this talk, I'd really like to see university farms and large successful farms doing a better job of sharing their SOPs. I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and I think it's one of those resources that larger farms can put out there and help some of the smaller farms that don't have the research staff to develop those procedures.
Very good, Dan. In fact, we wrote that down. That might be another webinar topic, is looking at SOPs and collect some of those and go that direction. Last question is, do you want to speculate why the lameness difference between New England versus California? Do you want to speculate why there was a difference there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually pretty easy. It comes down to the bedding, Mike. In California, essentially every farm we visited, all freestall, but they all are using dried manure solids. So they all have deep bedded. They're all deep bedded. In the Northeast, the farms that are doing well are the deep bedded ones. But there's a lot of farms which are using using other types of surfaces, mats, mattresses, etc. And that's putting those cows at risk.
Okay, well, Dan, you've done yeoman's job here. We had a couple more questions, but we just ran out of time at this point. We want to thank you very much for your dedication. Abby, do you have any closing comments you want to bring in?
We just thank everyone out in the audience for tuning in today. A reminder that the next webinar will take place on Monday, May 12th at noon Central Time. And I guess until then, I would say farewell from all of us here at Hoard's Dairyman and at the University of Illinois.